Thank you, Father. Thank you all for being here. It really is a pleasure for the Public Policy Institute to partner with the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville on this lecture series. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second before we introduce Pat Cobain and our guest presenter. But briefly, a word about the Institute itself and how this came to be and what our hopes are for the future. The Public Policy Institute here at JU is 4 years old. Established in January of 2012, and there's three pieces to it. First is the academic program. We have 4 graduate degree programs in public policy. We offer a master's degree in public policy, which is a 2-year program. And as part of that program, we have some extraordinary internships. Our students so far have already interned at CSX, Florida Blue, the governor's office, the mayor's office, the JEA, Holland and Knight, and a lot of great organizations, public and private, here in the state of Florida. In addition to the Mpp Degree, we offer 3 dual degree programs, meaning the master's in public policy and a second graduate degree. So while you're doing this, you can also get your MBA through our business school, which takes 3 years instead of 4. If you were to pursue it separately, it would take 4 years. You can also get your MPP and a graduate degree in marine science through our Marine Science Research Institute. And the director of that institute, Quint White, is here tonight. Where is Quint? There's Quint back here. And so we're one of the few marine science graduate programs in the state of Florida. And you can also get your MPP degree and your law degree through our relationship with Florida Coastal here in Jacksonville. Very briefly, the first MPP degree, for some of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a relatively new degree, was first conferred at Harvard in 1971. Harvard created the first MPP program. The very next year, program started at Duke, Cal Berkeley, Michigan. Today, there's over 50 MPP programs in the country. And here in the state of Florida, this is the only MPP program in the state of Florida here at Jacksonville University. And in April of this year, we were very pleased to confer the first MPP degree in the history of the state of Florida. So we started off with 12 students. Today we have 31 in our first cohort. We're still new. And so we're very, very pleased with the academic part of the program. But in addition to the academic foundation is a second piece, and this is where the Hesburgh lecture comes in. We have sought as an institute to be a gathering place, a sort of a central, neutral gathering place for public policy education, like tonight, discussion, and debate. And we want to do that through a variety of public policy programs. And the Hesburgh Lecture Series is one of those examples. In the first year of the Institute, actually it may have been year 2, I was making a presentation regarding the Institute, and Pat Cobain, the president of the club, came up to me and said, "Rick, I think there's something we could do together that would be wonderful for the community, wonderful for the Institute, and wonderful for the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville, the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville." And that's exactly how this got started through Pat's initiative. And so this is the third. The first year we had a lecture on the debt crisis. Last year on energy policy, and tonight, as you're going to hear in just a little bit, about climate change and also carbon dioxide emission control. In addition to the Hesburgh lecture, however, very briefly, we also have a series of policy forums, policy conferences, guest lectures, including drawn a lot of statewide attention. The governor came, the Attorney General Pam Bondi, congressional leaders Andrew Crenshaw and Corinne Brown. We're very pleased when Mitt Romney accepted our invitation last spring to give the commencement address and to shake hands with our first graduating class in the spring. And so we've been able to attract a lot of great speakers and programs here to the Institute. In addition, for the first time in the history of the university, we hosted televised debates here on campus in the mayor's race and the sheriff's race. And we are preparing for and have a partnership with Channel 4 to host Senate races next summer in the primary and also for the general election. And as you may have seen, we were a finalist to host a presidential debate. One of the only school from the state of Florida was on the short list, so we're very pleased with that. And by the way, a radio program called Policy Matters. Tonight, I do want to mention to you that we're very pleased to have with us Sean Birch. He is with WJCT. You may know WJCT does television and radio and news. We do a quarterly radio program called Policy Matters, in which I am the host. I don't think Rachel Maddow or Rush Limbaugh are too concerned about it just yet, because we're right down the middle on this thing. Sean is the executive producer of First Coast Connect. You may hear that with Melissa Ross. He's also the executive producer of Policy Matters. Tonight's program, tonight's lecture, and the questions that will follow are going to be taped, and after getting it so that it fits the time, we're going to replay this on the radio, tonight's lecture here in Jacksonville. So we're very appreciative of our partnership with WJCT. And on the policy programs, in addition, one last thing, a couple weeks ago we launched our first poll, a statewide poll in the presidential race right after the CNN debate, and we hope to be doing many polls in the future. So there's the academic program, there's the policy programs, and then the third piece is policy expertise. We have 20 faculty members. We offer over 60 courses. We have 31 students. We have a 25-member board that's extraordinary. And we hope, as our chairman of our institute board likes to say, that we will become sort of a central address for matters of importance in public policy. We put all that together. We hope to play a very constructive role in helping to shape the future of the region and the state of Florida. We were very pleased in part of that role to partner with the Notre Dame Club of Greater Jacksonville. I just mentioned that. We did that with Pat. And we have a variety of different approaches that we've taken. For tonight's format, let me just say this before I introduce Pat, who will introduce Dr. Jensen, talk a little about Notre Dame Club. Tonight, when you hear from Dr. Jensen, he's going to make his presentation. When he's done, he's going to take questions from the audience, and I will be moderating that discussion, so please keep in mind anything you'd like to ask. So it'll be very participatory after the end of his presentation. All of you, of course, know him, but I'm very pleased to introduce Pat Cobain. Now, in this room, this is a big statement. If there's somebody in this room who loves Notre Dame more than Pat Cobain, I'd like to know who it is. Okay, I have some nominees. When it comes to passion for your school, I will say this. I do think Notre Dame is in a very special category. The people who go to Notre Dame, there is a passion about Notre Dame. There is a love for Notre Dame that, with their alumni and the people, that is unlike anything I've ever seen. It truly is extraordinary. And Pat Cobain could be the poster child for that. He graduated from Notre Dame Law School in 2005. After that, he went to work for two of the finest law firms in the state of Florida, both as a shareholder at Marks Gray and then at Gray Robinson. Today, he's a legal consultant and does financial services with Ullman Financial Services. He's also president of the Young Lawyers section last year. He's president of this, and the Governor, Scott, appointed him to be on the board of directors for the Jacksonville Aviation Authority. He's a great credit to Notre Dame. We are very pleased to have a partnership with him and the club to present tonight's lecture. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Pat Cobain.
It's great to see everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. I remember when we did this last year, we had the rains that we had up in the Clemson game a couple weekends ago, so it's great to see great turnout. So before we get started, I first of all want to thank Rick and Amy. If you would stand up, please. Amy has been very instrumental in putting this all together, and you'll see the brochures on your chairs. Let me tell you, the Public Policy Institute in 3 years has grown exponentially. And I remember when Rick was doing his tour, floating the idea of the Public Policy Institute, I said, we have got to get in there because I know that this Public Policy Institute is going places. That I knew. But here's what I didn't know. In 3 years, I had no idea that this Public Policy Institute was the first public policy institute in the state of Florida. I didn't know. I was pretty sure, but I didn't know that Rick was going to assemble one of the best advisory boards that I've ever seen in this city. If you flip open your folder and you look at the advisory board of the Public Policy Institute, I mean, you're looking at the business and the political elites in this city. And the 31 students who are enrolled in this program, if government and politics is where they're interested in a career in public policy, then they'd be foolish not to start anywhere else, especially if they want to be in Jacksonville. I didn't know that after being 2 years in existence, that Governor Romney would accept Rick's invitation to be Jacksonville University's commencement speaker. I didn't realize that the mayor and the sheriff's debates for the city of Jacksonville were going to be hosted here at JU. I didn't realize that Bob Shercliffe, who many of us know and love, would make a substantial gift to the Public Policy Institute to conduct a statewide presidential poll. I didn't also realize that JU was going to be a finalist to host a presidential debate. So what's happened here in 3 years is unbelievable. And if you talk to Rick, he's going to tell you about his vision to build an auditorium that faces the river where the presidential debate will happen, and I guarantee you that's going to happen. I just don't know if it's going to be before 5 years or before 3 years. So normally at the end of this, we give a gift, but I kind of want to mention this beforehand so it doesn't get lost. Our club makes a donation to Jacksonville University's Public Policy Institute on Dr. Jensen's behalf. JU has hosted us. They put on this beautiful reception. So if everybody can please give the Public Policy Institute a round of applause, I'd appreciate that. Okay, so we're here for the Hesburgh Lecture Series, and I want to say a few brief words for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Hesburgh Lecture Series. The Notre Dame Alumni Association, which is our umbrella entity, which is responsible for the coordination and the organization of the more than 275 Notre Dame alumni clubs worldwide, puts on this Hesburgh Lecture. And the Hesburgh Lecture Series started in 1986 because some donor said, hey, I want the club to do more than community service and get together and watch football games. So now we have this continuing education component of the Notre Dame Alumni Association. So every year we have more than 200 Hesburgh lectures given by more than 100 of our top faculty members. And tonight's speaker, who I'll introduce in a minute, is no exception. We have the chair of the Department of Economics from the University of Notre Dame. And because Jacksonville University is such a great partner, because the Public Policy Institute is such a great partner with us, what we do is we get our Hesburgh lecture catalog and we work in tandem with Rick to pick a speaker that we think is going to be interesting and timely in current events for the Public Policy Institute, and that we think our Notre Dame alumni and friends would be interested in. So that's a little bit about the Hesburgh lecture and a couple updates about our Notre Dame club. For those of you who think that you have to be an alumnus of the University of Notre Dame to be a member of our club, you're wrong. We have some of the best, what we call subway alums of any university in the world. And Rick was kind enough to include this one-page sheet about our club. So if you want some more information about our club and the activities that we're involved in, just pull it out. And there's 3 easy ways to contact us. You'll see our website right under the logo. You'll see our club email address. And you can follow us on Twitter. And if you see me on the phone, it's because I'll be doing some live tweets of things that I think are compelling. So I'm not being rude to our speaker. Couple updates about our club. 275 Notre Dame alumni clubs worldwide. And for the second time in the last 3 years, our club, for last year, we were awarded the outstanding club from the Notre Dame Alumni Association for our size classification. Some upcoming events, we play the Southern California Trojans this weekend. And every Saturday that the Irish play, our club gathers at Finn McCool's at the Jacksonville Landing to watch the game. So all are welcome to watch the game with us. There's one exception. For the Temple game, October 31st, the Georgia-Florida game is going on. That kind of takes priority over the Landing. So don't be looking us on that Saturday. And then somebody told me recently that Notre Dame is playing a football game here in Jacksonville next year. November 5, 2016, our club will be the host club for the Notre Dame Navy game, which we're really, really excited about. There's going to be a lot more to come that you can find on our website about that. And if anybody needs tickets to the game, we have a website, and the Jacksonville Sports Council has reserved some tickets. So come find me afterwards. I'll share the website with you. We're trying to limit it to local Notre Dame alums and friends. And then every Christmas we do an adopt a family program. So we'll have more information about that. So a little bit about our club, a little bit about the Public Policy Institute, and now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jensen. Dr. Richard Jensen, as I stated earlier, is the chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Notre Dame, and has held that position for an astonishing 13 years. So either nobody else wanted to do it, or he's been doing such a great job. And I'd like to give an honorable mention to his wife, Gay, who traveled with Dr. Jensen from South Bend. And in the car, I learned that it was Gay that Notre Dame wanted to hire, and she said, well, I'm not coming unless you hire my husband to be a professor. She also told me he gets an allowance. But Dr. Jensen received his PhD in economics from Northwestern University and has been a member of Our Lady's faculty since the year 2000. As I stated earlier, he's the chairperson of economics and a faculty fellow of the Institute of Educational Initiatives, the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, and the Notre Dame Energy Center. His primary areas of expertise are the economics of innovation, microeconomic theory, and environmental economics. His current research interests are the economics of intellectual property, especially the effects of the Bayh-Dole Act on the research of university faculty inventors and its application, and the bioeconomics of invasive species. So a lot of diverse interests in the field of economics. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, tongue twister, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and the Ewing, Marion Kaufman Foundation, and has been published in the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the Journal of Economic Theory, Review of Economic Studies, Management Science, and the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, among others. He's a fellow of the International Journal of Industrial Organization, and just a couple of other things. Dr. Jensen was sharing with me on the ride over that the university had a competition, and instead of spreading their money over all of the academic programs and trying to enhance them all at the same time, they had a competition. And Dr. Jensen, on behalf of the Department of Economics, competed for and won a $4 million grant, which allowed him to hire 15 new faculties and has elevated the economics program at Notre Dame to be a top 20 national economics program. So we're very proud of all Dr. Jensen's magnificent work. We're thrilled to have him in Jacksonville. And the only thing he asked was for good weather. So we delivered. But with all that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Jensen.
I wanted to give just a brief overview of what's going to be happening tonight. Back in 2007, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change basically issued their proclamation about what was going on, and I'll talk about that, and people, most ordinary people were going, well, what does this mean? And I kept getting calls from the local radio stations and newspapers, and even students in classes saying, well, what does this mean? What does it mean? So this talk is an attempt to sort of talk about that a bit. And there are going to be parts in it where I'm going to throw up these tables of numbers, and you may well want to leave the room, and that's okay. I guess, first of all, what I'm going to do is talk about how economists estimate costs and benefits of any public policy change. So in that sense, this is a good venue for that. The one in question in this case has to do with this particular recommendation made by the panel. And so let me talk about how this starts. The first few figures I'm coming up with basically come from this panel. And so here's what they're worried about. I mean, I should also point out, I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't believe about these issues, but to provide you with information so you can make up your own mind. Because what I like about the Hesburgh lecture series is the continuing education aspect. I mean, Notre Dame has a commitment, and the Alumni Club have a commitment to lifelong education, and I feel like that's part of what I'm doing here. But so this graph is a nice example of what's going on. Across the bottom, we're talking about, this is today, and we're going back in time thousands and thousands of years. And on the left side, we're talking, changes in temperature. On the right side, we're measuring changes in the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so here's the concern. There was a really warm period back in here. Let me move on here. This is the so-called, the ice age is back here when it's really cold. The interglacial warming period is in here, and we spike up to this level. So this is, some people say this is not the first time we had high CO2 levels. But what's happened here since the Industrial Revolution is we come around here, we get this huge spike, higher than ever, and it happens at a really short period of time. That's part of the concern. The second part of the concern is that temperatures tend to move right along pretty steadily with the level of CO2 in the atmosphere because carbon dioxide, like methane, or so-called radiative force gases, they tend to trap heat. Sunlight comes in, and the more this, and some of it gets reflected and bounces back into space. How much depends upon the thickness of the atmosphere and what's in it. And one of the things that helps hold in heat is carbon dioxide. Methane's another. We'll talk about carbon dioxide tonight because it seems to be the one of most concern. And so the more of that there is in the atmosphere, the higher temperatures are, and there tends to vary together. And that's what they're seeing here. If you just sort of look, that look like they're moving together. And that's the concern. And so part of what and so this is what they talk about. This is from the panel. So part of the concern is that what's going to happen is maybe temperature will rise. And so here I have for you another one of their graphs. And so here what they're talking about is essentially temperatures rising. And what we've got going on here are past levels of emissions coming up to where we are now, scaled down a little less dramatically. You can still see the spike there, but it's smaller because we're doing it in terms of temperature changes now. And so here's what's going on. If the panel says if you want to stay pretty much where we are around year 2000, we'd be pretty flat like that. And then what we've got over here are 6 of the competing models of climate change out there among various scientists in the world. And here are their predictions about what's going to happen in temperatures if we don't do something. And as you can see, and this is one of the problems in this area, there's a lot of variation here. The lines here, the colored lines, are the means of the estimates. And for those of you who don't know statistics, don't worry about it too much, but when statisticians make estimates, they basically will say, here's a single point estimate, which is sort of the average of what might happen, and then they put a band around it saying, how confident are we in this estimate? And so these guys over here, if you look at the bars, they sort of represent the 99% confidence interval. And what that says is we're 95% sure, given what this model tells us, that whatever the temperature change is, it'll be somewhere in this band, and that's where the average is. And so here is one of the real problems with this subject matter, is if it's the least of them, we're talking maybe a 1, could be as little as a 1 centigrade temperature change. That's 2 degrees. The average temperature rise by 2 degrees. In South Bend, I'm pretty happy. Okay? On the other hand, it could be as bad as 6 degrees Celsius, which is about 12 degrees. And so, let's check this out first. Here, what that would mean is the average temperature rise by 10 degrees. That means in July and August, you're over 100 degrees pretty much every day. If the humidity stays the same, I don't want to be here. Okay? So what's the problem with that? Well, let's take a look. Last of the so-called scientific slides I've got for you. What could we think of as causing this, and where's it coming from? So here we just got time here, and across the bottom we're just going out through time again. We're measuring CO2 on changes on the left-hand side. And the idea here is the stuff, on the right-hand side we're talking about what's been going on just in the first 7 years before the panel introduced its study. And so if you take a look up top, we're talking about these are things that add to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and things below are sinks. Where does it end up residing? It's the sources on top and sort of where it ends up going on the bottom. And so if you look up top, what you can see is fossil fuel emissions have been climbing dramatically, and that's what's generating most of the additions of CO2 to the atmosphere. The loss of forest is another good one, another major cause. It's not as dramatic, but, and why is that? Well, if you look down here at land, trees are a source, plants, trees, whatever, basically absorb, live off carbon dioxide. And so the more you cut them down, the less sink there are. If you look down at the bottom, a lot of the CO2 just ends up being sucked up in the ocean. A bunch of it goes into land. What land means there are the trees that are still there, frankly, and whatever flora we have are still sucking it up. And then a bunch of it resides in the atmosphere as well. And so this, leads people to conjecture pretty easily, I will say, that, wow, all these fossil fuel emissions are dumping in the atmosphere, and here's another reason to look at what's going on. And in fact, the problem is exacerbated by, cutting down forests in various parts of the world. Okay, so why would we worry about this? Well, why do some people worry about it, perhaps I'll say? Well, so there are some human health, and so part of what I wanted to get at is there's a lot of discussion about, there are clearly, as more CO2 gets dumped in the atmosphere, you change the climate in some way. How? That's not such an easy question to answer, but there's at least some evidence here that's going to make the world warmer, and that's going to have some effects. What might those effects be? Well, reduced air quality for sure. More CO2 in the air means that you're breathing less oxygen possibly. That can be a problem, especially for people who are stressed in some fashion, in respiratory fashion. Going to be water shortages because more is going to evaporate. And these problems are predicted to be especially bad in Asia and Africa, where it's the hottest. There's increased heat stress for livestock and decreased crop yields, which basically means fewer food sources for people. Growing population, that can be an issue, obviously. There's certainly a decreased risk of plant and animal species extinction. There are quite a few, half dozen biologists at Notre Dame who are working on this issue and who have basically found out simple things like as temperatures rise, a great many animals who are used to living in certain local areas will simply be flushed out. Their habitats will vanish. One might ask, why do you care about this? Who cares if we've already lost quite a few species? What the heck? The issue really here is biodiversity. Biodiversity has value in a lot of ways. Some of it is as simple as if some of the species that go out are like potatoes or in the Irish potato famine, you could have a big problem. People have heard about the Irish potato famine, but my understanding from biologists I've spoken to is the real problem was that what happened at that point in time was that the Irish farmers have come to focus on growing one type of potato because it did very well in that climate. Then when a rust came along and attacked that type of potato, it just killed the crops year after year after year because they didn't have any other types of potatoes that were resistant to the rust to plant. So the fewer species you have out there, the more likely you are to run into this kind of problem. From my perspective, the other good reason to obtain biodiversity is that most of the cures for cancer come from some sort of plant out there. Like the rosy periwinkles apparently been credited, some particular chemical found is credited for generating most of the cures for breast cancer we have now. So, I mean, this is all, but so there are sort of concerns. The other concern is adjustment costs. One of the parts I find sort of unusual about this and difficult to comprehend, I come from Kansas. And so it's the wheat belt currently. But if, temperatures rise 10 degrees there, it's not the wheat belt. It could become the cotton belt possibly if they sort of do some adjustment. The wheat belt moves up into Canada, out of Kansas, Nebraska, and moves up into Canada. Well, so that's good for the Canadians, right? It's not so good for them. But at the very least, there are a lot of adjustment costs going on. What they see. So, and that will cost money too. Okay, so what's supposed to happen here in Florida? And if we look at the high emission scenario, which in the high temperature change scenarios we talked about, then what would happen? Well, basically a lot of Florida goes underwater. Maybe don't care if Miami-Dade goes underwater. But you live fairly close, and as I walked out the hotel, that river seemed awfully close to where we were. We went to the zoo today, and that river seemed awfully close. So, your zoo goes under. You have a great zoo, by the way. We went there today, this morning, and enjoyed it enormously. But it seemed pretty close to the water. I'd hate to see it go under. But like I said, but so there's a lot of that. Another thing, there's if indeed weather gets worse, and as a result, on average over time, then the conjectures are maybe adding $111 billion, another $111 billion in damages each year, and maybe get an additional 37 hurricane-related deaths. Other than the loss of human life, that's also a loss of income, and I'll come back to that later to give you an example. But so these are the kinds of things we're talking about. So let me get to these recommendations because that generated all this. So what happens in 2000, 400 scientists from almost every discipline you could think of get together under the UN auspices, this intergovernmental panel on climate change, and they basically do a ton of work trying to figure out what's going on with climate change, the environment, predominantly CO2 emissions, and what effects that might have. And so they basically claimed that there were going to be effects of the type we saw in that first graph, and that could cause some problems, and they tried to come up with some estimates of that. And so this is right out of the report. And so it says, well, if we wanted to sort of bring fossil fuel emissions back down to 2000 level by the year 2030 and keep them there, this is what we need to do. We have to adopt policies that would add $100 to the cost associated with each ton of carbon dioxide emitted. How many people understand what that means? I don't have a clue. Okay? If you would tell me how much CO2 was emitted burning coal in your local power plant and what that cost increase would do to the cost of electricity, then we've got something we understand. The next one is a little easier to understand. You all know what you'd feel like if you had to pay an extra $1 a gallon for gasoline, particularly given that gasoline prices come down recently. That's a good thing, right? I mean, most people think, but this would raise prices by $1. You'd have to adopt some sort of carbon taxes for cap and trade emission, and then here's the big one, the bottom one, which basically they make this comment, say, well, this is our estimate is that this would require a sacrifice in growth over the time period between now and 2030 of about 3% of world economic output. Okay, and then this is 2007, remember, just before the big crash. And so they had this fabulous line. They followed it, and I couldn't help but quoting it. In other words, the world economy will grow robustly, just at a slightly lower rate, while nations take steps to avoid severe climate change. Well, within a year, the economy has crashed worldwide, and suddenly, a 3% reduction in growth looks pretty bad because there's no growth going on at all. It looks much worse. Well, so a few years later, they revised this estimate. So now they're down to, only 1.5%. And there were a few jaded souls out there who thought they revised it down just, to make it look less bad. although who knows? I don't think so. But so the point of this talk is, among other things, what the heck does that mean? $100 in carbon emissions, I don't know. Can we do something with the fact that we're going to have a reduction in output of, say, 1.5% by that year? What does that mean? What I'm going to do is give you a dollar number per person in the room. Okay? And then you can decide for yourself how you feel about that. Okay. So what I'm going to do in particular, now that because these numbers came out in 2010, when I first did that, I started at 2011. And it projected beyond there. We're in 2015 now, so you might say, well, why don't you adjust the figures? Well, I can, but I didn't. And I didn't because I wanted to keep this geared with what they had. I think when you take a look at what I did, you'll see there's not going to, we could redo it all you wanted to, and you're not going to get much difference. How do they do this? What's going on here? Well, and I think this is really important because remember what they said they're going to have to do is either put taxes on carbon emissions or use a cap and trade system. What they'll do is sort of limit the amount of carbon emissions. And so the only way you can do more is to buy a permit from somebody. People in this, if, they're going to hand out these permits, hopefully evenly in some fashion to, say, power plants. And the nukes are going, oh, right on, I don't need these. I'll just sell them to a coal-fired plant who needs them. But in any way you cut it, the people using fossil fuels to generate electricity are going to have to pay more. Well, what do they do with that money? They just absorb it, right? No. It gets passed. It increases. So basically what happens, as I state up here quickly, any form of producing energy that emits carbon is going to be more expensive to produce because it's being taxed. Part of that's it's going to get passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices. Consumers respond to higher prices by consuming less. Not gratefully, often grudgingly and angrily, but they'll be consuming less. When they consume less, fewer fossil fuel emissions are going to be created. And that's the whole point. It's just like our government and before the Canadian government basically almost taxed cigarettes going out of extinction by taxing it so high. Well, you can do the same thing with this. So what the IPCC did simply was saying how large an increase in the price of electricity and the price of gasoline would be required to reduce emissions to the level where we want them to be. And of course, the other thing this does, when you make it more expensive, this creates a real big incentive to create alternative energy sources, to conserve on energy, to all sorts of things. Although some of these change, conservation you can do immediately, the alternative sources will take a while longer, obviously. And so there's a lot of pain in the interim, and that's the whole point, really, of the opposition to this. But so let me take another brief digression into what's, they're talking about growth. The economies are growth measured in terms of gross domestic product. So, well, you might wonder, what the heck is this, and why do we care? Well, this is the part I really enjoy. They have definitions up there. Gross domestic product is basically the value of transactions that get recorded. Okay? And that's when it's core. And so, sales are made in the marketplace, that's a transaction. Revenue was generated, it goes to some business or somebody, that ends up as income in somebody's pocket. So basically, this is also a measure of national income, recorded, from recorded transactions. You'll understand why I'm saying recorded later on. But that's where this comes from. So it's a measure of income. People care about income. There are other things they care about, of course, but this is something that's easy to measure. This is why governments rely on this, okay? And so, maybe not a perfect measure. So basically what these IPCC recommendations do is say, here's going to be income loss per person, and so let's take a look and see where we're going. So the question now is, how am I going to forecast? I don't know what GDP is going to be for sure out in 2030, right? But so how would I forecast that? Well, what I did was, if we go back and look at GDP at the end of 2011, the first year this comes out, and why did I pick that? Well, as you probably don't pay much attention to this part of newscasts or blogs, but they'll let out these figures, and then a year later say, well, they'll revise figures for a year ago and that kind of thing. And so it takes them a while to settle down and figure out what. And so at the end of 2011, this is probably about the beginning of 2012, and that's when I want to start. I want to assume that we start thinking about this in 2012, and then by 2013, the effects will kick in, and then we'll go out to 2032, which is like 20 years. So we'll be looking at a 20-year span of what's going to happen. 20 years is just a nice round number. And it's close enough to 2032 to count. Okay, so at the end of 2011, GDP was $15 trillion, roughly speaking. I put the number up there. That's a lot of zeros, right? It's mind-boggling. But so now we've got to project that forward. How do we do that? Well, we've got to assume it grows at some rate. What economists will often do is something nice and simple and hopefully uncontroversial. And so what I did here was basically say real GDP has grown an average of 2.6% per year since World War II. We don't go back for World War II because that was an unusual period in production and growth, okay? And so we're just going to assume it continues to grow, and that on average, it won't be accurate every year, but on average, it's going to be pretty close to being accurate, we assume. Maybe not, And so if that's the case, then what would happen is after 20 years, at the end of 2032, our GDP will have grown to 25 trillion, another enormously big number that I can't get much of a grasp on. And so now the question is, okay, well, suppose, if we implemented these plans instead, and GDP was 1.5% lower, where would we be? Well, instead of 25.4 trillion, we'd be at 25.4, and we'd be down to, we'd be lower, and so, we'd be at 24.45 instead of 25.845. That's, about a $0.4 trillion difference? That's like 400 billion or something. We can work out the math yourself. Basically, I'm going to bring this down to numbers that we can all understand eventually. But so you figure out what the smaller number would be, and say what rate of growth would take us to on that path instead, and that's about 2.52% per year. And so now we've got that forecast. We got two forecasts: one for do nothing, and one for follow the recommendations, and the other one's like 1.5% lower after the end of 2032. Okay, so what's the average loss going to be? Well, I'm going to break this into per capita terms, and so what we're going to do is divide the national income figure by the number of people we have. Population at the end of 2011 was about 311 million. So if you divide that, you get an average income per person of about $48,000. That's a number we, at least I, can understand, as opposed to trillions. And so now we just need to see what would happen with that population too. Make the same estimate. Population's been growing at about 0.88% for years now. So we'll just assume the same thing, run that out in the same way to 2032, and then just divide each year to get income per capita, per person. And then we just compare the two. We'll get one of those paths for if we do nothing, and another similar path for if we follow the IPCC recommendations, and we get the, suffer the damage they estimate we will. And what happens then? Well, in the very first year, there's a loss of about $38 per person, which doesn't seem terribly high. The second year, it's $77, and it keeps growing per year because you're slowing down the rate of growth. By the end of that time period, it's up to $1,000 per person. If you add that up over the years, you get like $9,700. You can decide for yourself whether that's a lot or not. One way to think about this, if you have a family of four, only one person working, then your family's going to have to pay about what? 40, a little under 40, $38,000 or something. Well, so that's one. Now, this doesn't discount. What do I mean by discount? Well, economists and a great many other people would argue that losing $1,000 in 2032 isn't the same thing as losing $1,000 today. One way to think about this is if that's a bill you had to pay in 2032, then you could set aside less money than that now in a bank and let interest grow, and then you could still pay it off with less debt in the future. So that's one way to think about this. So if we discount in that fashion, if we picked 1% as the interest rate, which is about the best you can get in most places today, that would only bring it down to $9,600. If you get 3%, it'd bring it down to $9,400. What's amusing, in a sense, is when I first gave this talk before the market crashed, I was using 3 and 5%. Now those are just irrelevant sort of figures. Okay, so here we go. For those of you who like numbers, I got them. If you don't like them, I'm just going to be talking about, this is just what I just talked about. Here I gave you the summary. Here's the numbers if you want to see them. Here's gross domestic product. If we do nothing, starting at $15 billion in 2011, and just keeps growing by 2.6%, all the way to the 25,800, 8 trillion number. And then here's population growing at the different 0.8% from 311 up to about 384 million. Okay. Here I just divide column A by column B, and normalize it, so we're talking thousand, just regular dollars. And so we go from 48,000 up to about 67,000, okay? That's just if things pretty much progress as they've been going on. And then over here, we say, okay, now 2011, the number's the same because we didn't do anything. 2012, we didn't either. But if we kick it into beginning 2013, then what's going to happen instead of, this 15,869, we'll have 15,857. And so that's lower. And you keep going down. These numbers are all lower. The panel numbers, how gross domestic product will grow under the IP recommendations is the same. We still grow quite a bit. But at the end here, instead of 25,844, we're at 25,454. So there's a reduction there in hundreds of billions of dollars. The idea here is, here's where we start. This is just, gross domestic product per capita, income per capita. The blue line is what would happen if we did nothing. The red line is what would happen if we follow, the panel recommendations to reduce carbon emissions, and we get the kind of reductions they talk about. About the only thing I want to notice, obviously you're going to read it. We'll have, that was her claim. We still grow along robustly, but not quite as much. Yeah. What I would like you to notice is that this is going to continue to grow over time forever. It's going to get further and further apart. And that's because they're admitting it's going to knock down the rate of growth of the economy. Okay, what I did here, here's what the losses look like. This is how much income lost in each year. We talked about this earlier. Here's a table for that. Again, we're starting here at nothing in 12 because we didn't do anything. $38 the first year, $77 the second. This is what I had up on the screen before, right? Gross efficiency of $1,000. If we can discount these losses by 1% and 3%, the numbers are slightly smaller all the way down, although not a whole lot. The totals are the ones I had up before, about $9,000. And maybe in that term you can see it. This is sort of, another way to think about this, I call them loss. You can think about the bill we have to pay per year for a cleaner climate. If you want to think about it that way, you can. And here are the pictures of these, and you can see these are really, the discounting does almost nothing at these percentage marks, as you can see. Okay, so what about, let's think back to the original estimates. Let's suppose that, these jaded souls who think they just knocked down the estimates when the economy went in the tank in 2008. What would the other estimates look like? And the other reason I'm putting this up is to give you an idea of what I told you before. If I wanted to stop and pick up GDP today at whatever trillion estimate is and population day and run them out yourself in the future, you're going to get really similar looking things. And here's how to see why. I'll show you. In this particular case, if you use the 3% number, then and we just do the same exact analysis, we're going to get a slightly bigger diversion because the economy is growing less fast, slightly bigger losses. And those losses are going to start, instead of $38 in 20 it'll be 61, and instead of 77, it's 123, and it'll grow to 1621 instead of the 1,016 we had, so they're slightly bigger. Total income loss is 15,000, or in the 15,000s, depending on however we discount it, as opposed to the 9,000. So the revised figures are maybe a third less in terms of losses, but the patterns are very much the same, and the amounts are in the same order of magnitude, as we say. So now let's talk about, we got some idea about costs. What are the benefits? One of the problems with this area is a little tougher to estimate benefits. I gave this talk once, but essentially the benefits are you avoid all the problems we talked about before. We don't get heat stress, we don't lose more livestock, we don't get people sick and dying as a result of ever. We don't have these losses of property value. Miami-Dade doesn't go under, which might actually be a loss. A loss to you, I don't know. Depends. Actually, the other thing is New York. If we don't do anything, New York turns into like another Venice. Manhattan Island goes under, and maybe you think that's good too. I don't know. I'm not so sure how much it bothers me, but so anyway, we avoid all these things. But it's easy to say. Can we put some numbers on this so we get a feeling for what's going on too? I gave this talk once, and a physician in the audience sort of says, "Well, can you tell me how to use by this?" I said, "Can you tell me how many people will die?" If you can do that, I'll quantify it for you. But, you can ask me to do your job as well as mine. Actually, he could, but I didn't let him get away with it. But let me do a couple of examples, okay? One, they say things will be bad, air quality will hurt people. So one possibility, for example, is maybe due to air quality increase, heat stress, all this kind of stuff, maybe we'll just get a 1% reduction in annual labor force participation. Actually, people get sick and stay home, and you lose 1% of the total hours worked per year. Well, so this means we reduce gross domestic product and national income by about 1% annually, And so losses per capita would then grow from in this range here. And here's the obligatory typo. I can never get them all out. This shouldn't be 15 million. This is 15,508 from that other round. But so the IPC loss in the 3% case was about 15,000. Here, the only total from that 1% loss is going to be about 1,200. Okay, that's the sort of lost output and income from people staying home because they're sick more. In the case of the revised estimates, number was not 15,000, but about 9,500 or something. And so you look at this and go, well, this is weird. How come we lose 1% of the workforce, but the numbers of losses are a lot less? The difference, this is we can't back up. Oh, if we could, unfortunately, if we could back up and see that picture where they're seeing the difference between national income accounting growing. If you looked at that, you see what's happening is when you affect the growth rate, that's a different loss than just knocking down by 1% per year. Okay, so we'll forget about this for a second. But so that was the first example. That doesn't seem too big. Let me give you another example. And that was the idea that maybe 37 more people die in Florida due to a hurricane-related death. Well, so how do we quantify that? Well, so what I did was take a simple kind of idea. Not all those people will be workers. Okay, so labor force participation rate's about 63%, so that would be about 18 more deaths. That's going to be loss of income, right? So what would that loss of income be? Well, so what it's going to be is what I did was say measure the 18 workers lost times the average per capita income that year. In the first year, that's 48,000, remember? So you multiply that together, you get a number. And then what happens in the second year is that those people are gone, and you get a new set of 18 people who have died. And so you get 36 people not earning income that year. And then you go into the third year and you get another 18 people and they're not earning income. And so I assume that at least for this 20-year period, everybody who died would have been working on average. And that way you do get this kind of compounding thing you do. Like with the losses, you get compounding because you're affecting the growth rate. Well, with this kind of death scenario, you're getting compounding too, because those people aren't just gone and not earning income this year, they're gone and not earning next year and the year after as well. And you keep adding to that. So what happens then, now, I mean, that's a lot of iffiness in that, right? I mean, maybe not all these 18 people are earning income, maybe they can all be replaced out of the unemployed pool. But on the other hand, maybe some of them have a specialized skill and can't be replaced very easily. Lord knows we've heard a lot about, jobs, high-tech jobs that can't be filled because we don't have qualified people. And so that's why I use the averages. Because, because of the people who can't be replaced would be earning more than 48,000 a year. So we'll just stick with the averages and do that computation. And so that's what it is here. So we've got 18 people lost every year, and so national income losses range, and so those people lose income, you divide that by the whole population to concern loss per capita, so we can equate them to the losses from whatever. And they start pretty modestly at 2,700, but they go up to 102,000. And the total is 992,000 as opposed to the losses of 15,000 from the 1.5% loss of growth. Pretty astonishing, isn't it? Now, this class, there's jokes about economists making lots of assumptions, and, we're not the only people who do, of course. But, there are a lot of assumptions behind this. You might question them, that's fine. I mean, part of what I've done is showing you a way to work on some of this, think about some of this yourself, back of the envelope kind of methods. There are lots of other sort of potential costs and benefits in here, and it's not, so, I think you can see that both sides of the argument. There are clearly costs that have to be paid, no question about that. But there's some benefits here too, and a lot of the difficulty here is figuring out what the benefits are and what they would be, how many people really are going to die as a result of this, and how much productive labor is going to be lost as a result of it, because that's going to affect income too. There is a joke about economists sort of saying that their favorite expression, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And that's certainly true. Actually, the example I like to give is the buffet out here tonight was not free. You had to listen to me. But hopefully with a bit more. There's no such thing as a free, clean environment either. If you want to clean up the environment in some fashion, if there's been some damage you want to clean up, it's going to cost. It's going to cost everybody. And this particular, it isn't just carbon emissions. it's sulfur dioxide emissions or methane emissions or whatever, standard pollution. And the reason why I emphasize this now is that if it places a higher value on environmental quality, that's going to matter. Now, why do I emphasize that? Let's go back to, I said earlier I was going to come back to this notion of why national income is or isn't a good measure of welfare. Well, one of the criticisms I heard frequently among people is, well, economists sort of are really stupid measuring GDP because, you should measure green DP, you should be including the value of natural resources in it. And, when people say that to me, I say, when I was in graduate school a long time ago, 1970s, I was an RA for a professor in his 50s who had spent his whole career studying better methods of national income accounting. Economists know this is a crappy measure. But coming up with others is really quite difficult. But the reason I mention this now is I want to go back to what is the definition of GDP? It's the value of transactions. It's the value of transactions that are recorded. Marketplace transactions that get recorded. The reason that national income isn't such a great measure is not all marketplace transactions get recorded. Black market ones for sure, but others don't as well, and some strangely inequitable ones too. For example, if you clean your own home, that doesn't count. If you hire somebody, it does. Right? If you send your children to daycare, that gets recorded. If you keep them home, that doesn't. Why? It's not because people don't think they should be doing it. It's because it's easier to record market transactions. People have been doing this since the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Market transactions is how governments make their revenue. Transactions are what gets taxed. The value of property is what gets taxed. Keeping track of market value is what makes governments run. One of my former PhD students spent about 6 years in Washington as the syntax goddess. Her job at Treasury was to estimate expected revenue from alcohol, tobacco, and firearms taxes. An important function. They paid her a lot of money to do this so that the federal government could have an idea of how much money would be coming in from this source so they could plan. But so let me brief digression. Sorry about that. But so one of the other things that doesn't trade in the marketplace is clean air. Clean water doesn't trade, it didn't used to trade in the marketplace. Now it trades in the marketplace, although I'm not sure bottled water is the same thing as clean water, but clean air doesn't, although I was teaching a class once and some young lady complains, no, I've heard that in Mexico City that the air is so bad that they have these like phone booth things on corners where you can go in and plug in a quarter and get some fresh oxygen kind of thing. And some kid from Mexico was in the class just sort of objected and went nuts because the air is bad, but we don't have these things, trust me. But there is no market for clean air, and there's no market for a lot of environmental quality. And so those actions don't get recorded. A good question that some of you might have asked, and I'll hope it foresaw it, is, if what you're doing is taking money out, making electricity more expensive and tax revenues coming in, that's got to go somewhere. Why doesn't that all balance out? And in one sense it does balance out, but it doesn't balance out in this measure because clean air doesn't trade in the environment, so you can't see that. Okay? So some people would argue that looking at GDP losses is just foolish because all it is factoring in the fact that people have never been forced to pay for clean air, and if you could somehow value that and put it in, they might actually have higher net welfare. So that's the problem with using national income, or my quick view of why using national income or GDP is not such a great measure. But it's what we've got. Governments have been collecting this for centuries. They're really good at it. Okay? Really good. And so that's what we have. At any rate, let me just wrap up quickly. So, if we want to mitigate damages from any particular thing, it's going to cost us, okay? When I gave this thing at Kansas, the title of the slide was, well, so what have you learned, Dorothy? No such thing as a free lunch, no such thing as a free, clean environment. If you want to clean up this mess, it's going to cost us in things that are measurable, like GDP. But at a personal level, how does it matter to you? It matters how you value the trade-off between a cleaner environment and, say, more expensive gasoline. That's going to vary from person to person, and that's the problem with the political process, right? All this stuff has to get sorted out in public policy venues, and what I hope I've done tonight is give you a little better information about what the relative magnitudes would be, what some of the sources, the costs and benefits are, and how you might think about them.
Good evening. Your presentation was entirely based on the United States, but CO2 emissions are a global problem. You've ignored China, you've ignored Europe, you've ignored the United Kingdom, and these costs and these benefits are global. And you very quickly, for example, went over Africa losing 50% of its ability to produce a crop, for example. Well, that's pretty significant to Africa. And I thought the whole point of the intergovernment aspect of this was to engender a global response to a global problem. So could you extend your analysis to the costs and benefits globally of the efforts to reduce carbon emissions rather than just confine it to the United States?
Not in 2 minutes. But in principle, that can be done, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right, and that can be done. Anyway, I did this with numbers here because these are figures people will understand. It's an excellent question, though, because one of the things in the last slide I mentioned is that they're going to be costs, but the real problem is they're not born evenly. Okay? For example, in this country, and I don't know, when I looked at the window, I thought I saw two of these giant concrete structures that look like nukes. Is that nuclear? Okay. No, that's what I'd heard, so I thought, huh? I mean, if you know, my part of the country, if you fly into Cincinnati, you see the big plants on the Ohio. But so if you know, in France, where 90% of their electricity comes from nukes, in fact, they export electricity to the rest of Europe. They go, global warming, no problem, bring it on. It costs us nothing. In fact, we're going to end up making money selling to you. In Japan, too, although they've been less successful at containment. But, and within this country, the places where they have nukes, they'll be fine. But the people who are totally dependent on, say, coal, they're going to pay more. And so those numbers will be larger, the ones I put up. In the same fashion, I think the problem is really different in developing countries, I think. And here's the difference is that, first of all, they have lower levels of income. I remember years ago, I keep saying, I said James Bond, but that's not John Bond. He was the president of Vodafone, came to Notre Dame, gave a talk. I went to dinner with him with some other folks. He said he'd been talking with the premier of China. These guys are, I love to drop names. But the main point of the story, he said they weren't even about to think about climate control and environmentalism until their GDP per capita got up to $7,000 a year. That's one of the reasons to look at these figures, okay? And so these people just aren't going to pay the costs. Fine. And they argue they shouldn't have to. They say, you guys built whatever by dirtying up the place. Why should we have to pay now? And there's certainly an argument made in favor of that. And so what that would imply, if indeed we accept a policy like that, then that would imply that we're going to pay even more costs than that. How much more? That's harder for me to tell. That's not quite so easy because, if it were 3% globally and the United States had to pay it all, kind of a strong assumption, I could sort of work that out. After all, one way to look at this, go to look at UN data, see what our income is, a fraction of world GDP, and then just extrapolate. We don't have all of the GDP in the world, but a big chunk of it. I'm sure what the message is, but that would be a way to sort of make a quick, dirty estimate of it, frankly.
If we could ask us some other questions. Dr. Jensen, I'll follow up on your one point about the costs aren't borne evenly, which is a problem, particularly here in North Florida, because of its heavy dependence on coal. And the JEA is very heavily dependent on coal. And it reminds me, when I was in law school, I went and saw a speaker, F. Lee Bailey, for those of you who remember, a famous trial lawyer. And in his talk, he said, when I was a young lawyer, I lost some cases I should have won because I was inexperienced. But when I was an older lawyer, I won some cases I should have lost because I had experience. And on average, justice was done, which is kind of a problem with the averages here of costs. Depending geographically where you are, and depending where and who you are, that the average of $9,700 per person over till 2032 could be real problematic depending on where you are. The Clean Power Act here in North Florida is something we are concerned about given the time constraints. So can you comment a little bit more about this? how do you spread those costs? How do you make it so that it's equitable nationally, so that some areas geographically or some groups aren't paying a disproportionate amount? Is that possible from a public policy standpoint?
Well, that's a very different question. I think part of what you're saying is the way the system is set up, where the cap and trade is supposed to work, but it doesn't. I mean, basically what that would imply, what's going on is cap and trade allows you to postpone meeting emission standards by buying an allotment. Well, what's the difference between that and paying a tax? The problem here is that as long as this energy or anybody else has to rely on coal, they're going to be paying higher costs until they make the conversion. Everybody in the area will be paying higher electricity costs until they make the conversion. How high is that compared to others? Well, I think that would be a much more complicated problem. That's one of the reasons that the IPCC went with this global thing in X%, because it allowed them to avoid making these kinds of city by city, county by country kinds of comparisons. That gets tougher. I think one way to think about this is, there are too many unknowns too. I mean, how quickly does somebody develop? I mean, here, wind and solar could be a fairly quick fix, but it's going to limit. You're limited as to how much you can come up with, maybe 30%. And so that's going to reduce the pain some. How do you spread the costs? I mean, if you're a taxpayer, you can spread the cost by moving. You can limit your cost by moving if you don't want to do that. Other than public, in terms of public policy, other than that, the only thing I can think it would do would be if you started subsidizing areas like this. I mean, people,
Here locally, part of the conversation is that utility rates are a big part of economic development and attracting manufacturing jobs and other jobs. One of the concerns here locally is that in meeting the current requirements, if JEA bills go up disproportionately, which some people think they will, that becomes a very big factor in instead of coming here. Florida Power and Light in South Florida kind of likes this because they're not so dependent. So instead you see the jobs beginning to head south as opposed to the jobs being north. Now this isn't an argument against trying to address it. It's a question of how do you address this in a way so that you don't cause a dislocation in North Florida in particular.
Well, that I think was something, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but if you're talking within state, then I think this is something the state could address. And it's my understanding that states' rights and all that states would want to do this first. And so that's what we want to address within the legislature. I think from my own perspective, what I've thought about before is, yes, this is going to be more expensive. I remind us of when I was a baby economist teaching my first classes at Ohio State. I was talking about electrical utility regulation, and somebody complained vehemently that electricity was a necessity. They couldn't live without it. And I'm going, let's go back 150 years. Where was electricity? You can't, but that's a little facetious, but I think the idea here is a pretty simple one. I'm always in favor of protecting the vulnerable classes. It would be perfectly easy to put an extra, it's going to be painful from a filling out perspective, but you put an extra line on an income tax form saying how much you paid in electricity and subsidizing families in need. That would be fairly straightforward. But that doesn't solve the regional problem. That's something that's going to have to be settled within state by whatever kind of policies.
I'm going to ask you an easier question. We've studied the Clean Power Plan at length, obviously, and I'm in the finance area, so we're going to have to finance this some way. The EPA believes that by 2030, there's going to be an 8% reduction in the cost of electricity per customer. Do you believe that at all? Our studies suggest...
I can believe it. Because I'm a fan of technological change and innovations. I've studied it my whole career. Innovation has been the savior of humankind over and over and over again. Just ask Thomas Malthus, okay?
Right.
But so
to do it in the next 15 years.
Well, that's my point. I said that
we're not filled.
I think that's based on some fairly optimistic assumptions about technological progress occurring really rapidly and occurring in such a way that it can be advanced and put into place awfully quickly.
We're not philosophically opposed to the plan. Don't get me wrong. We're publicly in favor. But solar, for instance, which is being touted nationwide, and particularly you're seeing a lot about it in Florida, but the studies we see show that resource is available 25 to 30% of the day. And we are the Sunshine State. That's not a high That's not a base load type of capacity. We're going to need natural gas to back up that power, which is it's going to be costly to our customers. We're very concerned about it. I just
You
throwing
should-
a
I think you should be. I mean, part of this-
editorial.
yeah. I mean, because, it's sort of, even if you were average, these are non-trivial costs for families, okay? I mean, think about just the 20 average, GDP per capita is $48,000. If you're in a family of 4 and you're losing you just got to pay this $9,000 bill. That's equivalent to 30. I mean, it's basically nearly a year. I mean, I gave this to an audience once, and the lady said, "My parents just have high school educations. They never understand that." And I said, "You're kidding. My parents have high school education. They would understand what they couldn't buy for $9,000. You can't get a semester tuition at Notre Dame, but."
Yes, ma'am. A question over here.
Thank you very much for a very informative talk, and I appreciate your economic analysis of the impact from climate change from carbon emissions. But it has struck me repeatedly over the years how our discussions on carbon emissions tend to be deficient in looking at the whole picture. And I'm referring to that 25% carbon that goes into our oceans and the documented effects of ocean acidification. But in all of the economic analyses that I see and read about regarding carbon emissions, I never see the impact of ocean acidification also built into the impact on the climate change and due to the increased CO2. And I was wondering, the question finally is, are you aware of any effort to do so? Do you have any feel for the relative impacts of that ocean acidification, particularly relative to climate change? And thank you very much.
Thank you. No, I know the IPCC is aware of this problem, and they're trying to integrate that in that. One of the problems with come up with a single catch-all number like this is that it gets buried somewhere in the fine details. If your point is, I think, I'm not sure, you can obviously correct me, but people talk, one of the concerns in all the climate issues or environmental issues is what is often referred to as a simple threshold effect. If some problem gets to a certain level, then damages can jump to catastrophic. And that's part of what I hear from biologists about problems with ocean acidification is if you kill off the plankton, then we all go home because it's over, right? I mean, if we kill, that's the bottom of the food chain, and if we kill the bottom of the food chain, then we basically have killed life. I don't know how long it takes, but we have. So I know people are working on that as part of the overall process, but from my perspective, the costs enter this problem in two ways. One is there are direct costs of implementing the policies that you can see right in front of you. How are we going to do this? The other way costs enter are these costs out in the future that might have these damages that happen in the future if we don't do something now. And those are the benefits. Avoiding those costs is an economist without avoiding a cost is a benefit, just like not borrowing more money is saving. And those are really hard to measure. I mean, I gave you a couple of simple examples, and I'm not trying to make life easy, but put it this way: if the biologist could tell me what would happen, I could cost it out for you, and I could show you what what costs we would avoid and what the benefits would be. Okay, people working on it. Again, my position here, and I don't mean to sort of be facetious, but as an economist, there's only so much I can do. Another problem with the whole climate change thing is it's such a widespread phenomena that you need teams of scholars from a lot of different areas trying to work together to do it, and that's what the IPCC has been doing. But if you talk, now a lot of what I've got here, the first few slides come from one of the members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And you talk with them, they're still saying, we just don't, there are so many interactions and so much feedback going, they don't understand yet, they're just not sure. And that's, of course, one of the problems. That makes it really hard to estimate what those future costs would be and therefore what the future benefits would be. And I think, the acidification of the ocean falls into that particular category because they're just not totally sure. I mean, it's easy to say, well, if we killed all the plankton, life ends. And of course, that's an expensive kind of problem we would like to avoid. I sort of joke, but it reminded of an economist saying, if life ends, the value of life is in. Well, that's obvious. We clearly want to avoid that. But again, part of the reason what I'd like to this talk is to try to emphasize, the difficulty in coming up with estimates in a meaningful fashion. One other thing, if I could wrap up, psychologists have done innumerable studies where, we talked a bit about discounting. How much do you care about what happens out in the future? Because that's what these costs out there mean. I mean, we start talking about we're mortgaging our future generations. Fine. Some people care about that less than others. Another really interesting phenomena is that people discount future costs more higher than benefits. They care less about losses and costs in the future than losses and benefits. So, in some sense, there's almost a bias against policy or bias change because we might get some future benefits way out there, so what? It's not as important as the benefit we lose today. And that bias is even greater on cost versus benefits.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jensen. My question, your model shows a very linear loss in GDP, I should say, over 20 to 32. Is there any chance that a change in consumer practices based on energy cost increase could exponentialize that?
You mean exponentially? I don't know. I think what I was first question was going to be IPCC tries to work in their estimates into those figures. I don't believe their models suggest anything happening exponentially.
But more dramatically.
Well, I think the answer to that's a lot similar question to this gentleman's question is if it's possible that there are limits to what conservation can do, just like there are limits to what solar and wind can do. And so that could help a little bit, but if you think about the ranges I had, in the final analysis, I think it's not going to matter a whole lot.
Dr. Jensen, you may have addressed this earlier, I'm sorry if I missed it, but in these assumptions, did you assume this would be worldwide compliance?
No, say if the whole world adopts this thing, this is what, because they said the 3%. I think
It kind of goes to this gentleman.
if we just that was your question. If only we do this, then there may be no reduction in emissions at all, because they spill over from everywhere else. So that would be. But the point here was that suppose we unilaterally try to decide to do this, then we could still bear those costs, and there would be no benefits because there would be no change. Although part of what I drive at here, I don't know what those costs look like to you is a purely personal thing. But one way to think about this is if you had this bill to pay, it was like X dollars per year over the next few years. How would you feel about that?
Yes, thank you for a very informative talk, Dr. Jensen. I really enjoyed it. I teach ethics and public policy here at the Institute, and I'm constantly harping on my students about the issue of externalities in economics, and particularly in cost-benefit analysis. So I really enjoyed your talk. But you kind of stole my thunder a little bit at the end when you admitted the existence of externalities and the difficulty of predicting them. And
this is the painful life for economists.
so thank you for that. And I want to remind my students who are here tonight to pay close attention, if you haven't already. But I also wanted to ask, isn't there a benefit that it is indeed difficult to calculate, but you yourself expressed great faith and confidence in the ability of technology to keep up with some of these changes and help us out of some of the difficulties we've created. Are you calculating those changes in? If we look to COT mitigation, is that calculated in?
They're making estimates that based on current best knowledge and practice. That gets really difficult. That's some of that is worked in, yes. And one of the criticisms of what they did is they're maybe being too optimistic about that, and GDP growth losses will be even greater. Who knows?
As an ethicist, I'm paid to be a pessimist, perhaps even more pessimistic than an economist. But
that's okay. No, you don't want to make us look good. That's okay with me.
well, we always have to look at the worst case scenario and the downside.
No, I think that makes sense. Let me just I do have faith in that, but one of the things about, are they factoring that stuff in? Yes, no, they're trying to. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know. I think, what I'm driving at here is, nobody's asked me what I would prefer. That's fine. But many years ago, the Union for Concerned Scientists asked me to come to Washington on their dime and lobby Indiana's representatives and senators on behalf of climate change legislation. And what I learned was nobody wanted to talk to me. Even though I was chair at Notre Dame, they couldn't care less. And I actually had met Senator Lugar before. This was back before he got seated. And they were saying, like 95% of my mail says, we have to avoid this no matter what. This legislation will kill me. Please don't do it. And so they're sort of like, this is like suicide. Why should I do it? But what I was trying, and so they actually want me to go in and criticize them and say, naughty you should have supported the legislation. I say, you're out of your mind. What I did was go in and say, if this is definitely coming down the road, and it is, probably, and if you're going to be levying these taxes or generating this revenue with cap and trade, then the income from that should be poured directly into R&D to try to solve some of these problems. And in fact, it ought to be R&D going into universities where the best scientists are working on these issues, even today as we speak. The engineers at Notre Dame say that some of these alternative sources are within like 30% of being cost effective. Well, that's actually quite a bit. That's a big gap. But, they're working to push it down. I mean, that's...
Well, Dr. Jensen, that's the final word for today. We have a little gift for you. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank Dr. Jensen. If you please join me in giving a hand to Dr. Jensen. While we have a hand, I want to thank Sean Birch and WJCT for recording the program tonight. I want to thank Pat Cobain and the Notre Dame Club. But most of all, I want to thank Dr. Jensen for flying here from South Bend for a terrific presentation. And we have a little gift for you.
Thank you.
As a little memento of your trip here to Jacksonville University in North Florida. And we're very pleased to have you here. The what? Oh, excuse me. They were mentioning this. This is a little note from me. Okay. And so we want to thank you very much for being here for the third annual Hesburgh lecture. It was really a terrific evening. Thank you very, very much.
I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you all very much.